Nice to see many of you coming across from the keynote into one of the two sessions. So we're running two sessions at the same time. So my name is Mia Lindgren, and together with Narelle and Claire, we are the organisers of this conference. And I wanted to let me just see where we are. Start off also to respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and their elders past, present and emerging that are the traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne's Australian campuses are located, and also where I am located at the moment in inner city Melbourne. So in this session, and we've called it Thinking, and the way to, I guess, imagine that is a kind of mix between a workshop, a round table, a ordinary conference presentation, because we really want to create a conversation. We've got four papers to be presented. They're 10 minutes each. And then we have time at the end to bring together a conversation around podcasting and particularly looking at it from a research perspective. So I encourage you to use the chat as we have before. Put your questions in, we'll bring those together. Now we've got someone who is on mic. If I can ask you to mute your microphones. Okay, great. So I won't take up any more time except to welcome the speakers. And the first speaker is Helen Wolfenden. Welcome. I'll just unshare myself. Here we go. And you can bring yours up.
Hello. Hi, Mia. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I'm going to do one of those kind of talky kind of things that doesn't even really have a screen, but I wonder about popping up a slide anyway, just so that I don't look quite so big and there's only a little screen of me rather than a big screen of me. So maybe I'll do that just you know, for embarrassment's sake. Right, there we go. So it might surprise you.
Jump in just briefly. Sorry, Helen. I'm Dylan. I'm looking after the chat. I'm going to monitor time, so I'll ring a bell at about 7 minutes in, just so you know you've got about 3 minutes to go.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Dylan.
Yeah, cool.
No worries. So it might surprise you that I'm going to start a podcasting talk by talking about reading, but you know, go with me here. When my husband describes what happens to him when he reads, he says the words leap off the page at him. Now, this looks quite animated in my head. You know, I can see cavorting passages, jumping or floating up to embrace him, enveloping him in some kind of wordy, warm embrace. For me, there are no hugs when I read. And despite my best efforts and having done a lot of it, reading is always work for me. And if I really need to concentrate on something, I read it out loud, because a voice, even if it's my own, is what makes words make sense to me or makes them sink in. And one of the reasons I love spoken word audio is that for me, it unlocked information with an ease I had never really experienced in text. When I got my first graduate job, I was driving around as a sales rep for a large cosmetics company. And it was a job I loathed with every fibre of my being. And after a week of listening to non-stop commercial music radio, I loathed that too. Eventually, in desperation, I found myself listening to ABC Radio National, which is the kind of Radio 4 equivalent BBC highbrow kind of talk station. Unexpectedly, the world opened up. Just by sitting there, driving around, doing the thing I had to do anyway, I could suddenly engage in a conversation about Chechnya or macroeconomic reform or the latest scientific findings. I felt smart and engaged with the world, and all I had done was listen. It took me a while, but eventually I rerouted my whole professional life to this cause, talking to interesting people about interesting stuff and trying to share information about knowledge. It's a path that's taken some turns, but it gets us to this story about this podcast. And for me, the great thing about podcasting is that it loves a bit of meta, which is just as well, because this is next level meta. This is the story of how a podcast was made about a paper that was about a paper. You might need a few seconds to try and let that idea sink in. So let me unpack the first paper first. It was something that a colleague of mine in Scotland, Paul Tucker, tackled when, as a television director turned academic, he decided to write an academic paper about a television program he made about the Glaswegian pop idol star who decided to see if she had ancestry in the Gaelic Hebrides of Scotland. But after his abstract for his paper was accepted, Paul's attempt to translate the work into an academic journal article ran into some difficulties. He asked me to help, and then I corralled my husband, who's a much more experienced academic, to also help. And we got it over the line. The paper was published, which is one metric of success. But while I'd been part of that process of transforming the paper into a piece of academic writing, I wanted to know much more deeply what needed to happen for that transformation to take place. So we wrote a paper about a paper. This is the second paper. And we went back and we spoke to the people, the program makers who'd made that program about the Glaswegian pop idol star in the first paper. And we asked them how they felt about their work being in this academic form. We also spoke to the editor of the journal about how he was feeling when these drafts of this paper were going wrong. And we unpacked in detail how that transformation into an academic piece of work had taken place. My job in the process was to be in charge of making sense of the interview data. In academic terms, that was identifying key themes and strands. But I did the academic work in a form that I was much more comfortable working in as a radio maker. What I really did was deal with the data in the way that I would if I was editing radio interviews. And because I'm an audio person and I'm committed to all that extra context that's embedded in voice, I wanted to stay in audio for as long as possible before we put the words down on a page. I used Pro Tools, an audio editor, to tell my co-authors the story of what our interviewees had told us as clearly as I possibly could. Effectively, I made us a little podcast to discuss our findings, but it wasn't that little. We made a transcription of that work and that got turned into the conventional academic article. And of course, we had to include the other academic necessities, literature review, theory, methodology. But we had this little podcast as our guide to help keep us connected to the core of this story. And eventually my husband said to me, "You should publish this. This is really cool." And I went, "Yeah, that'd be easy. I'll just turn it around, see if I can get someone to host that. That'd be awesome." And that's a little bit like hearing the phone ring in a horror movie, isn't it? You know that someone's going to pick it up and it's not going to end well. And of course, I made several mistakes and underestimations when I blithely took on this suggestion. In the first instance, we'd not recorded those interviews with the intention that anyone else would ever hear them. And I also hadn't realised how significantly that narrative needed to change from one with co-authors speaking about data to one that was available for a listening public. And I wanted to make this feel like a proper story, to put the voices back in there, not just to kind of read the academic article out. I wanted to turn it into something that felt like a narrative journey and had all those amazing Scottish accents of our original contributors. I wanted to see if I could actually translate the strangeness of the academic form into something that felt listenable. So after I'd rewritten and restructured the podcast, I had to try and find someone who would publish it. And it wasn't a kind of podcast in and of itself. It was a podcast episode, really. But I kind of landed on the Times Higher Education podcast pretty quickly and sought out Sarah Custer, who was the then digital editor. And we started a long conversation through the craziness of COVID about how we might make that work. And I'm super grateful to Sarah and the team from the Higher Education Academy podcast to find a way to make it happen. But, there's no question that it's a bit of a weird thing. As far as I'm aware, and, please correct me if I'm wrong, because it would be really embarrassing if I kept saying this and it's not right. It's the first time anyone has attempted to tell the whole story of a formal academic paper in a narrative podcast format. And I think that offers us some space to think about our relationship with sound, sophisticated concepts, and communicating them in a range of accessible forms. Now, I should point out, as I do in the podcast, that there are invariably compromises that are made in any translation process. I haven't, for example, tried to cover the literature review in the podcast, and I have given theory and methodology a fairly light touch. As you might expect, the focus of the podcast is the interviews, the voices. But the scenario I imagine is someone like me, someone who likes big ideas and complicated conversations, but all too often doesn't have the confidence or the patience to tackle the text of a complex piece of writing itself. And so those ideas stay inaccessible and out of reach. Any of us who work with students know how hard it is to get our students to read the assigned texts. Our fragmented attention means that more and more I hear people talk about how hard they find it to read. I hear even confident, experienced readers express this to me. But what if we could create a path? What if we could use the downtime of a commute, remember those, or cleaning the house, to experience rich and detailed ideas in a way that doesn't feel like the high stakes exercise of sitting down and reading a formal academic journal, and that is the experience for some people. How might that open up pathways to these more challenging forms of expression? It's not that I think a podcast can do everything a journal article can, it can't, but it can also do things that a journal article can't do. It can deliver us the richness of voice, bringing to life characters and convey the often passionate feelings that underpin the words. Perhaps most importantly, it can also create a new pathway to the journal article itself and maybe help the retention of some of the additional detail that a paper can convey. Now, creating a podcast takes a lot of work, and this was very much an experiment. And not many, perhaps no other academic papers are going to have a podcast like this made about them. But I think there are more opportunities to find ways that spoken word audio can unlock the doors to knowledge by using the sophisticated sound telling story skills that have been enhanced in the podcast era. We used to think that we couldn't convey complicated ideas in audio form. Podcasting has taught us that we can, but we haven't yet taken all of that potential in some of the more complicated information forms, including some academic forms. Academic knowledge production is still largely locked in writing. From here, I'd love to see more experiments in this space, how we can use the convenience of our devices and our headphones to offer people alternative pathways to information and knowledge. And while words don't jump off the page for me like they do for some people, they're much more likely to come and grab me when they're conveyed by a voice and the most powerful immersive tools of podcasting. Then the voice, the sound, and the knowledge that they convey can worm their way into my ears and into my thinking and into my understanding. For so much knowledge transfer, we insist on the gateway of the eyes. And we know that people's capacity to take up information in that way is not equally distributed. There is yet untapped potential, I believe, to liberate the most interesting and complex ideas through the skillful use of what we might call the oral portal, an underused gateway to the brain. Thank you. That's my presentation. I'm a radio person. I tried to keep it to time, Dylan, so.
That is
right on.
Yeah, right on. That's the beauty of working with people who are used to doing live broadcasts. Thank you so much, Helen. Nice to see you. Can I
You're
ask
welcome.
you to unshare?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, there we go.
Great. And I'm just going to pop this up and remind everyone of the next presentation, which is going to be done by Britta Jørgensen, and it's a project that I'm also involved in. So take it away, Britta.
No.
At least I think so.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having oh no, I can't share my
Your screen.
screen. It's not letting me share.
Can you post it in the chat and I can share it for you?
Yes. I can send it to you, Mia, if that works.
Yes. So why don't we do this while Britta and I organize the technology, that we will ask instead that Jason Pallant, are you happy to present ahead of us? And that way we won't take up any precious time.
I was just about to suggest it. So
fantastic. And
we're
Jason is one of our colleagues at Swinburne University.
Amazing. I think we can see this.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's a pleasure. As Mia said, I'm a senior lecturer in marketing here at Swinburne, and I'm relatively new to both academia and podcasting. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to learn from the presenters and some of the practical workshops. But I also, when talking to Narelle and Mia when I saw this conference was happening, talked about, would it be interesting to talk about, I guess, some experiences as a early career academic trying to navigate, all of the possible things that you could do with your time. What is the value? What is the impact, opportunities and challenges from being a podcaster as also a researcher? I'm going to try and explore some of those today. To do that, I'm going to start with a bit of a story, which is a personal experience of mine. I want you to imagine yourself having just started a new job, your first full-time proper academic job after being a research fellow for many years, and working and doing research and having done a report that has essentially compared the value of two different big supermarket loyalty programs. Now, that is a report that has got quite a bit of media interest, which of course is great. It's a nice profile builder and the uni is very excited about it. And you get invited to do a pre-recorded TV slot, sort of sharing some of your findings. So of course, you tell everybody about it. You tell your friends and your family that you're going to be on national TV and how exciting is it going to be. The film crew comes to your office and they record you. And you've prepared, you talk for, 20, 30 minutes, you get into the nuance and the details about the two programs and how they compare. They tell you that the show will air the next morning, which is fantastic. You get up, you set to record it, your family's watching. And your 20-minute discussion of the nuance of different loyalty programs ends up being an 8-second grab. And the 8-second grab that they use is the start of a sentence where you have said, the Woolworths Everyday Rewards program will definitely be better value for consumers, which you then go on to say, as long as they spend on the products that Woolworths are happy for, whereas for other consumers, Coles will be much better, which of course, the national TV program doesn't use any of that nuance or that back and forward. They run with the grab that is going to get attention. Now, the next day, you come into your office and you get a call from an unknown number, and it is a room of executives from the other major supermarket who happen to be a past client of yours, asking you why you were on national TV, saying something that was, largely untrue. Now, that is my personal experience of trying to share research and insights through other channels, particularly news, TV channels. And it's part of the big why and reason that I have been really enjoying my foray into podcasting. And those reasons, I think the big message, particularly as an early career researcher that I've found, is that as a podcast, whether that be as a guest or whether it's as a host, it's the opportunity to share your voice, share your insights, share your research, but control the narrative. And I think that's something that took me quite a bit of time to learn, is that not all public engagement, public dissemination is equal, right? It's great. It's very nice to see yourself, on a national TV program and to screenshot yourself with these, your employer's logo and your name. It's not so nice when they cut you to fit a narrative that is theirs and not necessarily your own, and not necessarily, in my case, a factual or true representation of what you were trying to say. So I think for me as a ECR, the opportunities there from a longer format like a podcast, where you can share a topic in depth and you're not beholden to those few second grabs that a TV show or a radio program might want to get out of you, is a real opportunity. As is, as I said, that ability to control what the narrative is. Exploring both sides of an argument, diving into the nuance, is something I think as researchers is critical, but something that doesn't always fit the time constraints that other media channels might have. And then through that process of getting into podcasting and trying to share longer form insights and research, I've discovered other benefits that I think are really beneficial or useful for particularly early career researchers. And one of those is being able to make connections. I found that by now being labeled the host of a podcast, which is just myself, it's a much easier way to make a connection or reach out to somebody, eminent people in my research field, by inviting them to be podcast guests. I'm finding that a much easier, and I find I get a lot more responses to those kind of requests than as a relatively unknown academic I would get if I just asked them for insights into their work or comments on my own work. And of course, by talking to people, getting the ideas and hearing what they are talking about and being able to get into that long format nuance of whatever their topic area is, I've got a lot of ideas for myself that have led to other research opportunities. And then other benefits from that, which I didn't really anticipate going into it, were I've found it's actually a really great way to create teaching content for my classes, particularly in the current formats that we have, where particularly at Swinburne, we're being encouraged to do blended learning and have pre-reading or pre-listening or pre-watching sort of content before we run our classes. Having the ability to actually create that through the podcast and not relying on trying to find the perfect YouTube video or even pre-recording myself talking at a screen, I think that ability, that content has been really engaging for me and for my students. And of course, in a sort of self-promotional way, having some stats around the number of people who have listened to your podcasts or the guests that you've had, I've found have been really nice for CV, for promotional opportunities. So in terms of the how, I actually had quite an interesting journey into podcasting, where in a previous job working for a consulting agency as part of Monash Uni, we actually tried to start a podcast on behalf of the group as a way to build the, prestige of our group as a whole. And it's fair to say it was a bit of a failed experiment. None of us had really done any kind of podcasting before. We thought ambitiously that because we were used to doing public presentations, podcasting would be easy. It wasn't. It failed relatively quickly. And then I had some opportunities to be a guest on other podcasts, which I think was actually a really useful opportunity. And one of those shows actually asked me then to become the co-host, and now I've taken over the hosting duties. So I think my advice there for early career researchers thinking about getting into it is, get into it, but perhaps don't dive straight into trying to host a show on behalf of a large organization like I did. And the rest of what I was just going to show here is just some of the examples of what I was talking about before in terms of the connections that I've been able to make through the show. My show's about retail, which is my research area, and it sort of tries to dive into shopper behavior and shopper psychology. And some of the people I've met have been founders of companies that are now my research partners. One is the leading trade publication for retailers, who has now asked me to be a regular contributing writer. One is a creator of a research platform for qualitative interviews, which is now being used by our staff and students at a discount. And those are all kind of connections I wouldn't have had without having that backing of being part of a podcast. These are just examples of my teaching content where I'm embedding my episodes now as part of my classes, trying to encourage students to actually listen and use that as part of my teaching, and being able to create that content by inviting guests that are going to be relevant to my classes as well as the broader industry. And the last thing I guess wanted to touch on is that it is very challenging as an early career researcher, as anything is that is new. What you're seeing over the right-hand side there is my recording setup while trying to record episodes during lockdown. Yes, that is a toilet paper box with a nappy box in my son's nursery room. But so far, it has been enough to at least get some things out there, have a bit of fun. And so the next steps for me is trying to commit more time to it and grow it. So thank you very much for that. I'd love to connect. I'd love to hear opportunities. I noticed Siobhan suggested, collaborating, working with people who know it. And I think that's something I'll definitely be taking on throughout the rest of this conference. So thank you all.
That's just brilliant. And to see that photo, there's a great collection of photos of people recording sitting in wardrobes and under doonas and wherever you can, as long as you've got lots of soft things around you. So I was just wondering whether there were only boxes, no nappies, no toilet rolls actually positioned around you to give you the best sound.
That could be the next step if we're in this lockdown for much longer.
Thank you very much. So with that, we'll go back to Britta, and I will put up, hopefully we can do a little tandem. Britta is in Queensland, and I will put up the screen and hopefully that works. So that should be working now. Let me just start from here.
Great. Thanks, Mia, and sorry about that. I always seem to have some problem when I'm presenting on Zoom. Something goes wrong. But this is a presentation about a project that Mia and I are working on together anyway. It's about superbugs, otherwise known as antimicrobial resistance, and the two of us are working as part of a team with producers Sarah Mashman and Sylvie Van Wall as well. And we've spoken and we've written a lot about this series and spoken about it a lot with our kind of academic hats on, and have kind of had less of an opportunity maybe to speak with our podcast maker hats on. So I think that this is kind of a good opportunity to look at it from that kind of perspective. But to give just a little bit of background context on the project, if you want to go to the slide about our background context. Yeah.
Can you see that now?
Just slide 3, I think it is.
I know. Well, that's what I'm looking at. We should know this, shouldn't we? Okay, so I'm looking at that. Why don't I just pop out and we'll put it in, I'll just do it in, I'll take us out and then I'll come back in and we will do it like this. No, yes.
There we go.
There we go.
So this is a little bit of the background about the project. It's part of an Australian Research Council Discovery Grant, and part of like an interdisciplinary, inter-university kind of project looking at kind of narratives and media reporting of AMR or antimicrobial resistance. And we're sort of the small team looking at the podcast side of things and making our own 6-part podcast series. So we've been working on this for a couple of years now, and during that time we've had many conversations about how we can use podcasting to engage listeners in a topic that is really difficult to explain, that is really scary, and can also be kind of gross as well. So in the next slide, We can head to that one, Mia. This is the way that the issue is often presented visually. So a lot of clashing imagery to scare people into action, childish cartoons to explain the complexity, and all these different words to kind of explain the same thing. Superbugs, antimicrobial resistance, AMR, multi-drug resistance. But it's essentially about the looming threat to our global health on top of COVID, when antibiotics no longer work because bacteria develop resistance. And it's an enormously complicated issue to explain, but we thought that podcasting might be up to the challenge. So when we started this series, it was just Mia and I, who are both researchers and producers. And we started from a place of like, what are the main issues and how can we explain the complexity? How can we use a constructive journalism approach in terms of giving people tools and solutions instead of just scaring them into switching off? And as we brought in our other producers who weren't also researchers and really got stuck into making it, we realized that achieving these things would be more complicated than we thought. The challenge would be in trying to achieve a lot of different goals at once. So it wasn't possible just to give little thought to the podcast medium and focus only on the science and research goals, but equally we couldn't kind of just go wherever the stories took us at the expense of the issues that we really needed to cover. So, and as part of this project, we also listened to a lot of podcast episodes about superbugs and noticed that they tended to fall down in one area or the other. So it would be quite a challenge to combine the two. Maybe the next slide. I can't remember what's next. Yeah, some of our aims, I guess I kind of just went through that, but we needed to, some of the challenges as well were in balancing personal anecdotes with scientific research, interpreting the scientific evidence and asking the experts the right questions, trying to get across the enormity of the issue. So scientific, medical, societal and political issues. We had to really educate ourselves before we could educate the listeners. So one thing we did is bring in an expert at the end to check through all our paper drafts to pick up on things that we might have missed or ways that we might have emphasized certain issues in an unbalanced way. And being a podcast format, we had to kind of simplify those paper drafts to make them clearer for a non-podcast producer. So this was a huge concern kind of looming over us the whole time. We didn't want to be spreading any more health misinformation. And being researchers, we could read and find credible peer-reviewed research, but not being microbiology researchers, it was really difficult. We found that we had to simplify the information for the ear and for listening, but without oversimplifying. So we came to a bit of a realization that collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration is really important and missing from this field, where it's so critical at the moment. We took our researcher minds and did really deep dives into the research, logging our reflections, using the audio medium itself to record team meetings, keeping detailed spreadsheets of people we contacted, and getting consent forms from all the interviewees. And we tried to share those complex processes in our final making of kind of episode, drawing on that tradition of narrative self-reflection in podcasting. Maybe the next slide. Yeah, so this is just an example of like one of our post-it boards. We did a lot of mind maps and post-it boards to like look through all these different kinds of complicated issues, which might not be something that kind of springs to mind when you think about creating a podcast, but it can be very complicated, especially if you're looking at such a complicated research topic. And we've got to the end almost now. Our trailer drops on the 4th of November. Some of our insights about educational or research-based podcasting that we came to were probably most importantly, thinking about whose voices you want to use. So we found it much, much easier to speak to the experts who could just ask, so who we could just ask the questions we needed to, and then kind of edit their interview answers, because they could summarize vast amounts of information or data on lots of people they or other researchers had spoken to. But that left out some of the nuance of the stories of those people, which we in podcasting know is really valuable to hear firsthand. It was also much harder to track down those people with lived experiences, and their storytelling may not be as succinct as some of the experts who speak on their research topics and try to make their topics accessible at their job all day. I think a lot more care has to go into those relationships as well with the non-experts. That's something that we found, and a little bit more of sense of responsibility for their well-being. If you're asking very personal stories about, and sometimes about their traumatic experiences. But people do usually want to share their firsthand experiences. And some of the people we spoke to who had experienced a resistant infection, for example, went on to actually work in the field or contribute to raising awareness in some way. So this all worked towards our research goals of using constructive journalism, which tries to empower communities to take action, for example, but it also just made for much more compelling podcast content because the medium is so well suited to that personal story. We also envisaged that the narrator, who is me, would be using my researcher hat to present this series. But in the end, we sort of ended up using a lot of my own personal stories and hearing my voice a lot more than we anticipated, I think. Because to maintain that distance and pretend you aren't a person might work in other formats, but when you're hearing the voice so intimately, it's just so quickly revealed as kind of fake to put on a bit of a persona or maintain like too much distance. You can't engage the listener's heart or mind without that authenticity and personal story in all elements of a podcast, even one about a huge global issue like superbugs. So we found that you had to hold the listener's hand through the complexity, the scariness and the grossness, or they'll just switch off. I think in the end, we achieved that balance, though through quite a lot of trial and error. And we're very excited to finally share it when the full series launches in Antimicrobial Resistance Awareness Week in November. That's the end.
Thank you very much. Just had to find the right buttons. And can I remind everyone that the audio of the presentations is available on the website where you register. So we did ask everyone to submit some audio examples. So I encourage you to go and listen to that. So thank you very much, Britta, for doing that presentation for us. Now we have the last presentation for this evening in this session, and I welcome Lauren and Gretchen. I'm not sure if you are both presenting.
No, it's just me. Gretchen lives in Montreal and is very much asleep. So my name's Lauren. Hi, just going to share. Oh, I'm going to share not like that. I'm going to share like this. I do have slides, but I'm in podcaster mode, so they're merely here for decoration if you want to close your eyes and stare into the middle distance. It's been a long day for some people on Zoom, I imagine. My name is Lauren Gorn. Along with Gretchen McCulloch, I am a co-host of the podcast Lingthusiasm. And today I want to talk about how the approach that we've taken to the show and our research communication project helps create an enthusiasm for linguistics that the podcasting medium is particularly well suited to. Lingthusiasm is a monthly episode show that also has monthly bonus episodes through Patreon. We're an independently produced and funded podcast, and we've been running since 2016. And part of what motivated us to move from being science writers and communicators, and both had blogs, and the appeal of podcasting is a term that Siobhan mentioned in her wonderful opening plenary, this concept of parasocial relationships. So this is a something that's been discussed in media theory and psychology for a long time, especially around television hosts as some of the earliest iterations. But a parasocial relationship is where you form a one-way media-mediated social relationship. Parasocial relationships have a lot of negative connotations when we despair at our teens being a little bit too obsessed with the current pop icons and these kind of things. But the power of podcasts to create these incredibly intimate relationships that we have with the content that we consume can also be leveraged really effectively by researchers to help people build a different relationship with a topic that they might have otherwise only encountered as a university educational course or through a very academic medium. And although Lingthusiasm itself is not driven by either of our research agendas, Gretchen is a full-time pop science writer, and my work is very much specifically in a couple of domains of linguistics, but we talk about a range of topics. And we've built a series of strategies over the years for helping convey complex linguistics topics in ways that are accessible and not oversimplified. And these are principles that are relevant and useful regardless of the research topic that you are conveying to a general audience. So I thought I'd break down 3 of these based on our discussion focus episode, which is about a sound that appears in almost every English word, but you've maybe never really tuned into it. It's the sound that makes the start and end syllables of a word like emotion sound the same. In unstressed syllables in English, this vowel takes over for pretty much every other vowel. And it's so prevalent in English that we actually have a name for it. It's called schwa. And we did a whole episode on schwa. One of the great things about it is very prevalent in English once you start tuning your ear into it. So we can make a relationship between people's everyday experience of speaking English, or like me, spelling English really badly. And once you realize that part of why you can never quite figure out which vowel should go in an English word is because it's a schwa getting in the way of you paying attention to what the actual vowel you should be writing is, makes it a lot easier to understand, for me at least, why I found spelling big words so pesky as a child. Another thing that we do is we minimize jargon, or we very sneakily use jargon that has sufficient transparency to a general audience. We have a rule of thumb of 1 piece of jargon per episode, which often means really preemptively scaffolding what we're going to talk about. Even though it's a conversational podcast, we do a lot of preparation around the scope of what we'll discuss so that we avoid using more jargon and bringing more technical terminology and more presupposed information that we assume people are coming to an episode with, which means that you can pick up the show in any order. For an episode like schwa, we had introduced, this was our hero terminology for the episode. And then the second most piece of technical terminology we had was something like emphasized syllable or vowel, which are technical terms that people have some sense of, but we definitely didn't go into anything more technical in terms of the phonetics of this sound. So that's another thing that we do. And then the other thing that we get to do, and I think it speaks to Jason's enthusiasm for nuance in podcasting, is that we deep dive into one specific topic per episode. I always like to think of it as someone who's a lecturer in my day job as that thing that you get to spend 1 slide on in class because you have to move on and cover the other 50 pieces of terminology in your lecture. We get to spend a half hour chatting about it. And that really opens up the opportunity to build a rich conversation, bring in lots of examples, contextualize it in people's lives. And because we are a podcast and not an assessment tool, no one has to be tested on it at the end. So that gives us a lot more freedom to do a deep dive into a specific topic. We are going to have episodes for the longest time. Schwa is just one of 100 or so different common sounds across the world's languages. So before we even get into other bits of linguistics, there's a whole range of phonetics topics that could keep us busy for months. So these are the 3 of the engagement tools that we use to create a light-hearted but not superficial conversation about linguistics. And then we've continued to build people's parasocial relationship with linguistics through creating things like we currently have a sticker offer happening on Patreon. You can actually see 2 of those stickers, the black and white one and the little floral one there are both schwa. We have a little schwa, never stressed, because it occurs in those unstressed syllables. Once you've listened to the episode, you can connect with that piece of merch and remember that you learnt something. We also have a variety of other ways that people engage through the Patreon. Originally, it was mostly a funding mechanism for us, but now, thanks to their integration with Discord, there's an independent community of listeners that exists around the show and continues to foster that parasocial relationship with linguistics, creating a new generation of people who are enthusiastic about linguistics. So that is what Lingthusiasm has done for building that parasocial relationship.
Thank you. How fabulous. And I'm now hoping that you will be part of improving the reputation of parasocial relationships, because I think that is something that podcasting really is doing. It's taking that bad name away, hopefully. So thank you to the 4 presenters, the 4 projects. I will now, oops, I just realized you can't see me now. What's happened? Oh, okay. You won't be able to see me. I'm going to be a podcast voice in your ear. My laptop camera has just stopped working for some reason, so we'll just have to do without vision. So I invite you to ask questions. We've got about 15 minutes. I've got a few questions, but I'm really keen to hear questions from the floor. And that gives me an opportunity to fiddle with my camera to see if I can get it working again.
Lauren, I'm really curious how you handle, how you found the Patreon Discord growth for community building around your show.
We brought in the Discord about 18 months ago, and I think I can honestly say I tolerated the idea that we would set it up for 3 months and then we would review it because I was skeptical. But one of the great things about podcasting is this long tail and the fact that the internet allows everyone to find a home regardless of their interests. And it is a community we set up with very clear guidelines. It's a place to talk about linguistics and linguistics adjacent topics. And we have amazing moderators from the community who keep an eye on things when we can't. So it's definitely been an unexpected but pleasant growth in terms of another area of the show. We've now started doing live shows in the Discord space for the patrons as well. So,
which was going to be my next question. Fantastic.
Don't be shy. Can't be shy in podcast world.
Mia, there's a question from Julia here about Patreon and funding that I'm happy to answer. Julia, the show operates kind of independently because there are 2 of us and Gretchen isn't tied to an institution. The show only exists because it can be funded. Both of us had full-time jobs when we began the show and we knew we didn't have the capacity to do all of the editing and production ourselves. So any complications that potentially arose were mitigated by the fact that it was really the only choice available to us in terms of making the show in any way functional or sustainable for us. And if anything, it's been a net asset, and the university has been really happy to support in a very hands-off way the maintenance of the show. We've done research projects together. The show has funded travel for me that has lined up with conference travel as well. So it's definitely been a net benefit for us. But obviously, this is general advice and not specific advice of a financial nature or whatever all those money shows say at the start. So
thank you. I might then pick up a question from Elise to all the presenters, and maybe I start with Helen. What are the novel elements that you think make your podcast engaging to your audiences?
I think one of the great things about podcasting as compared to broadcasting is its capacity to allow you to be uber niche, right? So you can kind of, take a deep dive down a rabbit hole. And the academic the paper that we translated into this kind of storytelling version in podcast form was, I guess, particularly about the struggles of practitioner academics, which many of us in this space might be familiar with, and having different forms of knowledge representation recognised by a place like a university, which has very set ideas about what knowledge looks like when it's created. So I think, there's probably a couple of things for me. I think one, a sort of a conversation for practitioner academics where they can access a form of, the conversation in a particular kind of way, a pathway into the journal article, as I say, and perhaps for other people, a way of experiencing the journal article that makes it easier to access rather than just kind of dealing with the text-based version itself. So there's a couple of appeals, I think.
Thank you. Jason?
I think for me, it's a similar thing. So coming from the commercial consulting, and I think I'm still targeting the show at retailers, like practitioners, right? And so there's so many retail podcasts, and they're all consultants selling something, right? They're selling their software or their whatever it is. And so I think for me, it's more, I'm trying to unpack something and take the deep dive, like picking a topic, like the experiential economy, which is the thing that gets thrown around all the time, and actually unpack what does it mean for practitioners? What should they do about it? What does the research tell them they're going to get the most bang for their buck for? I think that's what I'm trying to do, is play in that space between being someone who can talk an academic language, but translate it into something that listeners can walk away and do, whether that's in their jobs or next time we're at the shops, how to not get sucked in by Audi special buys, that kind of thing.
Lauren, do you want to have a go?
I think for Lingthusiasm specifically is that there are a lot of academic adjacent podcasts that are trying to be informational or clever, and we are merely trying to be enthusiastic. And so you don't have to engage particularly deeply, but there is kind of a gateway option there for you. We've both got other projects that can send you further down the linguistics rabbit hole if you like. And we very much subscribe to the 1,000 true fans theory of the internet and the power of niche content creation. So I'll put that link in the chat, regardless of whether you're trying to generate revenue from a podcast. I think it's still a really powerful way to think about the fact you do only need to be reaching the right 500, 1,500 people to be making a real difference as a media creator.
Rita, do you want to have a go? And then I can add a little bit as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess, what we were trying to do with our podcast was look at this kind of story that's been framed as very much a science story, and look at kind of the human stories that are part of that, which is something that really hasn't been done with Superbugs. Like, we've looked at so many ways that this story has been told, and I think, that narrative element and those personal stories suited to podcasting is what we really tried to do different. Yeah.
And adding to what you were talking about before, Britta, the last episode of the series is I guess, behind the scenes of why we're doing this research project and why we're using podcasting. So it becomes that nice kind of meta that Helen talked about in her presentation, and I think that's also something that is going to be quite useful for this project because it's funded by the Australian Research Council. So I think we do need to articulate the fact that this is research, and how are we using the podcast to test ideas around personal storytelling and podcast narratives. And we need to then write about it, which we will do later, hopefully, and not just produce the podcast. Other questions?
I might jump in and just following on about your project, Mia and Britta. I'm interested in how you negotiated accuracy and trying to synthesize what I imagine is highly complex scientific information with engaging storytelling and using narrative tropes like dramatic hooks and that kind of thing without overly dramatizing the threat of superbugs, because I don't know anything about superbugs, but it sounds quite scary. So I imagine there could be a temptation to kind of overly dramatize the nature of the danger they pose. So how did you kind of negotiate those two challenges?
So this is something that I know Britta and Sarah Mashman, who is a producer and presenter for ABC, works from Hobart, has thought a lot about. So Britta, do you want to share some of that? Because it's been a really important issue for the production part.
Yeah, so we really wanted to avoid telling that scary story of like someone who has, become infected with resistant bacteria. And just trying to scare people, but try and look at actually some of the broader societal issues around that and kind of delve into them through different people's stories. So it's been very difficult, and it's been great like having people part of the team who are not researchers to have their perspective on how we can really pull in some of that storytelling. But then it's also been like a real balancing act, trying to make sure everything is really accurate and draw on all of that peer-reviewed research so we're not spreading any kind of misinformation or like emphasizing threats that aren't as big as they might be portrayed elsewhere in the media. And yeah, trying to tell some of those stories. So yeah, it's been difficult. I guess it's been a challenge and something that we've had to think through really quite in depth in every episode. Yeah.
Thank you. Last chance, otherwise I think we might give ourselves a few seconds of standing up, running around, getting that cup of tea or go to the bathroom or whatever we might need to do before we have the final session for this evening or morning, depending on where you are, or afternoon maybe if you're in Western Australia. Okay. With that, a huge thank you to our presenters, making sure that you all know where to go if you're following. So you need to go back to that previous link, which of course I actually haven't got on me at the moment, otherwise I would post it in the chat. But someone else might have that easy at hand and can just post it in the chat. Will someone do that in the room? Excellent. This is why I love working with people who are collaborative. So you've got the link there. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next room.